Maybe as a preface, so Noah mentioned, don't trust anyone who's overconfident. So I don't know anything. Do not listen to anything I say. And let me figure out the clicker. There we go. So I'm at LangChain. We're a company that kind of sits in the middle of the AI stack between kind of application developers and the models. But I'll talk to you today about the simple topic of agents, which everyone's extremely clear on what an agent is, of course. So if you go back, the idea of an agent's been around actually for decades. This is from a textbook I pulled from 1995, and it was called A Modern Approach. Agents are still modern, they've always been modern, they've always been 5 years away. So this idea of agents is really charismatic. They define an agent really simply as a system that can perceive and act on the environment, okay? So if you go all the way back, we had robots, okay? The environment's physical world, the agent is the robot. It can perceive through sensors, it can act through robotic hands or some mechanism, okay? This is shaky from 1960s SRI, Stanford Research Institute. So this is an early example of an agent that we're all kind of familiar with, the idea of a robot, okay? Now what's interesting is the environments kind of became digitized with the web. So now there's these big kind of digital environments that in principle agents can operate in. And in the 90s, people were interested in this. So this is an article in the New York Times talking about this idea of softbots out of the University of Washington, which, funny enough, was some kind of online agent that could browse and buy you plane tickets. This is still the challenge we're trying to solve with agents. OpenAI's new operator release talks about buying you a plane ticket. So in the 90s, people were saying, yes, we can have agents that browse the web environment and do things for you. So it's not a new idea at all. It's kind of all this back to the future. But let me talk a little bit about the progression of agents in physical and digital domains. So it's kind of helpful to map them this way. So in the physical world, we're pretty familiar with this idea of robotics and moving towards agents, okay? So think about kind of on the x-axis, less generic to more generic. So the capabilities are less constrained to more constrained, okay? In the physical world, we've had robots can work in really structured environments, okay? That's like industrial robotics. That's like, you know, the Toyota assembly line. We've had this for a few decades, okay? Now, a bit more recently, we've had what we might call agents that can operate in semi-structured environments like factory floors. They're not completely constrained to like a robotic assembly line. They can move around, but they need guardrails, okay? And now we're moving towards kind of the Elon vision, the humanoid robot. Now, what's interesting is if you go from less general to more general, you have these agents that can actually interact in the world as we do, okay? So that's kind of the key progression, going from less general to more general, or even at the extreme, they can operate with the world just like us. So that's kind of the way this played out in the physical world. This is pretty intuitive to people. Now the digital world is the interesting that we're going to talk about, and actually highly constrained agents in the digital world are feasible today. Without AI, there's this stuff RPA, some of you might be familiar with this, but basically you can have very hard-coded workflows that you can set up. There's a number of companies that do this like UiPath. They're extremely brittle, they do not work generally, but you can do it. If you have some workflow that is extremely consistent, there are some companies that will set up what they call robotic process automation to achieve that particular workflow. That can literally be down to predetermining the pixel coordinates that the agent will click, and it can work for very constrained problems, but it's not generic, okay? So the big question is, what do these domains look like with with digital agents? That's like the big problem here. Now, the natural idea is let's jump all the way and just have AI agents, like we were talking about previously, that can interact with computers just like us. Okay, that's kind of the most obvious thing here. So this is actually a paper from OpenAI in 2017 where they tried exactly that. Give an AI system access to your computer, let it click around and browse the web for you, do web tasks. Same as the thing we saw in the 90s with the softbots, right? Same idea. Now the funny point here is, it was just too early, it didn't work, okay? And this project failed tremendously, although OpenAI went on to be somewhat successful with other things. But this was a failure of a project. They then moved on. This was back in 2017. They went and did RL for a while, and now, of course, the rest is history. But really what we need is digital brains, okay? And so the main point here is these charts don't matter. The point is up and to the right. So what OpenAI figured out in 2020 is that scaling laws work with large language models. The transformer architecture is very data hungry. You can basically get models to be predictably better as you add more data, more compute, and more parameters to your model. That's the big idea here. So what we've seen is models going from GPT-2, basically very consistently up to now GPT-4 and beyond, just by scaling the amount of data, compute, and parameters in your models. That's the big idea here. And this scaling law is held across many orders of magnitude, okay? That's the big trend. So what it means is we are now right here. So we have digital agents that can operate in a semi-structured way with digital environments. So all the stuff Noah showed, those workflows, right? Take my meeting notes, take my meeting video, transcribe it using an LLM to text, take that text, summarize it, write that to a database, read from the database end of week, summarize all those notes, write that to Slack. Classic workflow uses an LLM interleaved with a bunch of APIs. That's really where we are today. And look, this really works well. Noah showed a lot of examples. We work at tons of companies that do this. This really works, and I'll just show you some. These are a bunch of charts. They don't really matter. They look cool. That's the point. But listen, what's actually happening is you're taking LLMs and you're embedding them in different scaffoldings with like other tools. That's like Noah's thing, right? You take an LLM and you embed it with like, you give it access to Slack, you give it access to your database, you give it access to your meetings, and like you kind of interleave these steps together in what we call a workflow. This really works well, okay? That's what's happening. We see tons of companies doing this. And those workflows they're semi-structured, right? They have to rely on APIs. They rely on some fixed routing, and there's different ways you can set them up, and we could talk about that at length. And of course, you can also set up agents which are a little bit more open-ended, but they're all still basically using APIs to interact with other systems. So they're still kind of in that semi-structured regime, okay? Now, what are we seeing in terms of use cases and people interested in using things like we just saw with workflows? This was a report that we put out in late last year. We surveyed like 1,300 people, asked them what are your top agent use cases, and they kind of talked about research and summarization, personal assistance, productivity, customer service, code gen, data extraction, interactive gameplay, okay? So these are some of the use cases that people are interested in. I'll show you some fun examples. So, I mean, this is before OpenAI just released their own deep research tool. This was Gemini's deep research, okay? So this is basically an agent that can go and do research for you. So it can write very high quality memos. OpenAI just dropped this exact same thing. This is my little open source thing, which is fully local. So I'm just promoting myself here, but this is my little tweet on the same idea of automating web research for your use. And this is a great use case, okay? People are really interested in this. Automating social media. So we actually have a social media agent that works inside LangChain. It basically combs the web, it combs our Slack, it finds interesting stories, it packages them as tweets. We use human in the loop to approve or reject. We can send them out on a schedule. Classic kind of agent workflow use case, right? Automate tasks that previously human had to go cull the web, put that together. We're seeing more and more examples of this kind of thing. Coding's a no-brainer. Some of you may code, but you're probably familiar in any case with Cursor. In fact, the prior presentation talked about it. Tremendous use case for agents to support with coding. So really the lesson here is agents are 100% possible today. We're seeing them deployed in all sorts of useful workflows. They're semi-structured. They require some access to external tools like APIs. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening today. Now, where are we kind of going here? And this is a little bit of an interesting hint, and this was just referenced. So OpenAI dropped their operator thing. So operator, it harkens back to what we talked about before. Softbots in the 90s, agent that can just use the web as you do. World of Bits in 2017, OpenAI tried this a second time, where you basically have agents that can browse the web. OpenAI literally just released Operator, agent that can browse the web. And what's the idea here? The idea here is it frees you from reliance on any API. So this can take any workflow that a human does, clicking and browsing around, and it can replicate that. And it can learn that just from presumably video. We don't quite know exactly what kind of the onboarding mode is. Presumably you can take this thing and show it a video of what you do, and it can like learn that with sufficient training or something like that. I don't actually know, and I have not used it yet. Well, I've used it for personal use, but I don't know how they're deploying it in enterprises. That's kind of what I would call out. For personal use, you can just tell it a task, and it'll kind of go and try to accomplish that task. Like we saw the integration with Instacart, for example. But I don't know how this is happening in enterprise yet, but this is interesting. It's a sign of where things are going, and it kind of maps the physical world. Physical, we went from highly structured, semi-structured, to systems that can interact in the world just like us. Digital world, probably gonna be the same. You know, RPA, highly structured systems, current today AI that can interact with APIs in a semi-structured way to AI that can just interact with the web as we do and do tasks that we literally do using any tools without any API reliance. So that's kind of the story here that I think is really interesting. Message one, you can definitely build a lot of cool workflows today. Message two is we're probably going to a world where these things can actually just replicate anything we do with a computer, mouse, and keyboard. So it's pretty interesting. We're probably at the start of a 10-year arc here. This is a guy I really like, Andre Karpathy. He was very early at OpenAI. He actually did the world of bits thing. And you know, it's probably realistically going to take a decade for these things to really roll out. Imagine at your company, at what point will you actually allow an operator-style computer use agent to actually handle customer support requests or actually manage your social media? This is probably like, you know, a multi-year arc, but it seems to be pretty reasonable. That's where things are going. And I'll kind of leave it there, and we'll enjoy talking to people later. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. And I definitely encourage you to consider these tools, and actually, you know, to Noah's point, consider ways to actually implement agents today kind of as workflows in a semi-constrained way. And in the future, it's possible that agents will automate a lot of work that we don't want to do. So with that, I'll leave maybe a little early. Thanks.
Awesome.